The prince has always been raised with the weight of royal duties upon his shoulders. From an early age, he was taught that his personal happiness mattered little compared to the stability of the kingdom. Political alliances were the cornerstone of his future, and marriage was merely a strategic tool to secure his family's position in the court and beyond. His life was structured, his path determined by expectations that had little to do with love, but everything to do with legacy and power. As the wedding day approaches, the prince finds himself contemplating the event, his thoughts filled more with obligation than excitement. He has never met his bride-to-be, and the thought of marrying someone based solely on duty leaves him feeling indifferent. His advisors and family have all reinforced the importance of this match, painting it as an opportunity for political gain, but he can't help but feel the coldness of the situation. Rumors begin to swirl about his future wife, the princess he has been promised to. Whispers from his court tell of her appearance, or rather, the lack of it. He is told that she is not the beauty one might expect from a royal match. The stories vary, but the central theme is clear. She is said to be unattractive, even repulsive. Some say she has an unremarkable face, others speak of disfiguring flaws. The prince finds himself uneasy, burdened by these preconceived notions that colour his thoughts. He has never seen her, but the image of a plain, undesirable princess begins to form in his mind, making the upcoming wedding feel even more like a duty than it already is. The more he hears about her, the more he dreads the moment when he will meet her. He cannot shake the feeling that this marriage is a transaction, not a union between two people, and the notion of having to live with someone who does not meet the kingdom's standards of beauty adds to his reluctance. In his mind, he envisions a future with a wife who will never be able to live up to the idealized image of beauty that surrounds him in the palace. His thoughts are clouded with disappointment before he has even seen her. Despite these reservations, he knows that he must honor his family's decision. The prince focuses on the bigger picture. He has no choice but to follow the path laid out for him. His hopes for the marriage are nothing more than a faint whisper, buried beneath the weight of duty. In his heart, he doesn't look forward to meeting the woman who is to be his wife. He feels trapped in a world where love is secondary, and political alliances are the primary currency. As the day of the wedding draws nearer, he prepares for what he believes will be an awkward and uncomfortable ceremony. The prince is certain that his life will be forever changed, but not in the romantic way that fairy tales often describe. His reality is one of obligation, and he must face it, no matter how unappealing it seems. In the depths of his mind, the prince wonders if this marriage will even be worth it. He's heard too many negative things about his bride, and he can't help but picture a future where he is constantly disappointed by her appearance. It isn't just about beauty, it's about the pressure to conform to an ideal that he himself is struggling to embrace. He is a prince, a future king, expected to have it all. The princess, in his mind, is far from that. He can't help but wish for something more. Someone who would meet the impossible standards he's been raised with. Yet, he knows that such thoughts are fleeting. Duty calls, and the prince must face the harsh reality of his upcoming marriage, for better or worse. But little does he know, the truth about his bride will shock him in a way he could never have imagined. The princess was born into a family that valued power, wealth, and status above all else. Her parents, noble in their own right, always ensured that their legacy was protected and elevated. The kingdom was known for its opulence, and her family's reputation was built on the unwavering pursuit of perfection in every area. From a young age, the princess was made acutely aware of her role in preserving that reputation, even though it was something that she could not fully control. Her beauty, which was considered rare by some, was both a blessing and a curse. Though she had the delicate features of a royal, eyes that sparkled like emeralds, skin as smooth as silk, and hair that cascaded like dark velvet, she had been taught early on that appearance alone would never be enough. Her mother, A woman who had built her life on the principles of grace and refinement would often remind her that beauty could be fleeting, that it was the heart and mind that mattered most. But no one ever noticed those qualities about her. The princess, despite her outward appearance, longed for something deeper than the endless compliments about her looks. But in her world, appearances were everything. As she grew older, whispers began to surround her. Comments about her beauty were always laced with envy or cruelty. People began to expect more of her than she could give, placing her in a spotlight she never wanted. They didn't care to look beyond her face, her figure, or her silken hair. They didn't care to hear her thoughts, her dreams, or her ambitions. They only wanted the image of a perfect princess, a beautiful object to be admired from afar, not someone who could contribute intellectually or emotionally. To protect herself from this ever-present scrutiny, the princess learned to hide behind a veil. It became her armor, a barrier between herself and the world that judged her relentlessly. It wasn't just a piece of cloth. It was a symbol of the distance she had to maintain between herself and the world's expectations. Beneath it, she could breathe, free from the prying eyes of society. The veil gave her the freedom to be herself, to exist without being defined by her outward appearance. It allowed her to hide the truth, her fear, her loneliness, and her growing sense of isolation. The only solace she found was in her mind. It was here that she could escape the noise of judgment and explore the parts of herself that others refused to acknowledge. Her intelligence became her refuge, her ability to think and reason beyond her beauty, the one thing that no one could take from her. She immersed herself in books, in philosophy, in learning, hoping to find the strength to face a world that saw her only as a decoration. But no one saw this side of her. To the kingdom, she was merely a princess to be married off for political gain, a piece of currency in the game of royalty. As the day of the wedding approached, the princess found herself filled with conflicting emotions. On one hand, she knew that this marriage was an obligation, a duty to her family and the kingdom. Her parents had arranged it with the best of intentions, believing that it would ensure their place in the world. But the thought of marrying a prince she had never met, to live a life alongside a man who may see her only as a means to an end, filled her with dread. She feared rejection more than anything. The prince had heard nothing but negative things about her, and she knew that the rumors were likely true. The idea of a man seeing her face for the first time without the veil was terrifying. Would he find her beautiful? Or would he too reject her like the rest of the world had? The princess couldn't bear the thought of another man condemning her to a life of loneliness and invisibility. She was afraid of being seen for what she truly was, a woman who had been forced to hide her heart, her spirit, and her true beauty behind a veil. But despite her fears, she knew that this marriage was vital. It was not just about her. It was about her family's future, the stability of the kingdom, and the legacy of her ancestors. She couldn't refuse. The weight of her family's expectations bore down on her, and she felt trapped. She longed for freedom, for a chance to show the world who she really was, but she knew that would never happen. This marriage was her destiny, and the veil was the only protection she had left. As the day grew nearer, the princess found herself trapped in a cycle of anxiety and uncertainty. She couldn't escape the looming reality of her wedding, the moment when the veil would be lifted and her true self would be exposed. The fear of rejection consumed her, and yet she understood the importance of this union. She had no choice but to face it, no matter the cost. The veil was all that separated her from the world, and soon it would be gone. The day of the wedding arrived with the weight of centuries of tradition bearing down upon the prince. Though he had trained for this day since childhood, preparing for the role he was to play in the marriage of his kingdom, he felt a nervous energy gnawing at him. His outward composure remained impeccable, his posture as straight as the royal banners that hung in the palace halls. But inside, his mind was anything but calm. He couldn't shake the image of his bride that had been painted for him in the whispered rumors of the court. He had heard so much about her, most of it unpleasant, and the expectation of her appearance weighed heavily on him. The beauty of a princess, he had been told, should be extraordinary, something to inspire admiration and awe. Yet, the reports he'd heard suggested the opposite. He feared that the princess he was about to marry would fall far short of the lofty image he had in his mind. Was she truly as plain as they had described? Would he be disappointed? Could he, in his royal role, look beyond her looks to find something more? He pushed these thoughts away, focusing instead on the ceremony ahead. His duty as a prince, as a future king, was clear. This marriage was a political necessity, one that could not be avoided. He had promised himself that he would embrace his responsibility with dignity, despite the uncertainty that churned within him. The prince tried to center himself, reminding himself that appearances mattered little in the grand scheme of things. The princess was his bride, his future queen, and whatever she looked like, he had to accept her as his partner in ruling the kingdom. The grand hall was abuzz with activity. Servants rushed to and fro, ensuring that every detail of the ceremony was perfect. The air was filled with the sound of laughter, soft murmurs, and the gentle clinking of fine china. Guests from far and wide, nobles and royalty alike, filled the palace. The opulent decorations glittered with gold, draped across the pillars and walls, creating a dreamlike atmosphere. Flowers in hues of purple and white covered the pathways leading up to the altar, and the scent of them mixed with the rich perfumes of the ladies in attendance. The wedding was a spectacle. The music began, soft and enchanting, creating a sense of anticipation. As the prince took his place at the altar, surrounded by his closest advisors and family members, the enormity of the event began to set in. His role in this marriage, though overshadowed by his personal reservations, was vital to the continuation of the kingdom's legacy. He could not afford to let anything disrupt the carefully constructed image of royalty. And yet, beneath the surface of his regal demeanor, a sense of dread lingered, clinging to him like a shadow. The moment of truth approached. The prince took a deep breath, adjusting the collar of his royal robe as he waited. His eyes flitted nervously toward the entrance, where he knew the princess would soon appear. He had never met her, and though his heart was filled with confusion and doubt, his curiosity pushed him to await her arrival. What would she look like? Was she truly the woman he had been told about, the one whose appearance would never measure up to the expectations of his court? Or would he be surprised, shocked by something he had never anticipated? The grand doors at the end of the aisle slowly creaked open, and a hush fell over the crowd. All eyes turned toward the entrance as the princess, dressed in a gown fit for royalty, began her walk down the aisle. The intricate details of her dress shimmered in the soft light of the chandeliers, delicate embroidery tracing patterns of gold and silver across the fabric. She moved gracefully, her every step seemingly rehearsed, though her heart beat in a wild, chaotic rhythm. Behind the veil, her face remained hidden, but the prince could feel the weight of her presence, a tension in the air that seemed to thicken with each passing moment. The veil, a symbol of mystery and separation, draped her face, obscuring the truth of who she really was. To the prince, it was as though time itself had slowed. His gaze was fixed on her, the anticipation building in his chest until it felt as though he could hardly breathe. The veil that separated them seemed to hold both his curiosity and his fear captive. The princess's heart pounded in her chest. She had never been this close to so many people, and her sense of isolation seemed to intensify in the midst of the grand celebration. The weight of her own insecurities threatened to overwhelm her. The veil was her only shield against the judgment of the world, but soon it would be lifted, and she would have to face the reality of her marriage. Would the prince accept her as she was, or would he, like so many before him, see her as just another princess to be discarded for not meeting the expectations of beauty? She had heard whispers, too, of what the prince expected of her. She knew that he had been raised with an image of perfection, that beauty was everything in their world. Yet the truth was that she had been hidden away from the world for her entire life. The kingdom had never truly known who she was, and the people who had seen her before had often shunned her for the very things that she could not change. Now, as she walked towards the altar, she held her head high, trying to suppress the trembling in her hands. This was her moment to step into a life she had never imagined. As she neared the prince, her mind raced with doubts. What would he think when he saw her? Would she be enough for him, or would she be just another disappointment to add to the list? Both the prince and the princess stood on the precipice of a moment that would change their lives forever. And as the veil began to flutter in the breeze, the truth was about to be revealed, bringing with it a shock that neither of them could have anticipated. The moment had arrived. The entire hall seemed to hold its breath as the princess, standing at the altar, slowly raised her hands toward her veil. It fluttered delicately in the air, caught by the soft breeze that stirred through the room. The guests watched in anticipation, knowing that the moment of revelation was at hand. The prince, still standing in his place, felt his heart pounding in his chest. His eyes, though fixed upon the princess, seemed to lose their focus as his mind raced in a swirl of confusion and dread. The veil, which had concealed her from him for what felt like a lifetime, was about to come off. And with it, his entire world would shift. The princess's hand trembled slightly as she grasped the edges of the veil. It was the moment of truth, the moment that had been the subject of so many whispered conversations, the source of rumors and gossip, the cause of his growing unease. As the princess gently lifted the veil from her face, the prince's breath caught in his throat. For a brief moment, time seemed to freeze. The entire world stood still, and all eyes were fixed on the woman who had spent so many years hidden away. What the prince had expected to see, what he had been prepared for, was not the reality that stood before him. The first thing he noticed was the light. It seemed to glow from her, as if she were bathed in the softest golden rays of the sun. Her skin was flawless, the color rich and warm, glowing like polished ivory. It was not the pallor he had been led to believe, nor the imperfections that had been described to him in the gossip of the court. No, this was a radiant beauty, a luminous presence that filled the room. Her eyes were the next to catch his attention, large, expressive, and filled with emotion. They were not the dull, lifeless eyes he had imagined, but eyes that sparkled with intelligence, curiosity, and something deeper, something more mysterious. Her lips, slightly parted, revealed a gentle but confident smile, and her features were delicate, symmetrical in a way that took the prince's breath away. Her hair cascaded around her shoulders in soft waves of dark, glossy curls, framing her face perfectly. The intricate braids and beads that had adorned her veil now lay scattered across her hair, adding an exotic, almost ethereal quality to her appearance. The gown she wore, white and shimmering with embroidery, clung to her form, highlighting her graceful posture and the elegance in her every movement. As the prince continued to gaze at her, his mind struggled to reconcile the beauty before him with the image he had been taught to expect, the rumors that had surrounded her, the whispers of her supposed ugliness. Where were they now? They seemed ridiculous, laughable in comparison to the woman standing in front of him. He had imagined a woman who would disappoint him, whose face would be plain or, at worst, disfigured. Yet this woman, this princess, was beyond his wildest dreams. He found himself at a loss for words. His thoughts were a jumble, crashing together in a sea of confusion. How had he been so wrong? How could he have believed the court's cruel gossip? The princess before him was not the woman he had been told she was. She was more than beautiful. She was captivating, enchanting, and her beauty was so overwhelming that it left him speechless. The prince's mind raced as he tried to process the shock. He had been prepared for disappointment, for a feeling of repulsion. But instead, all he felt was an unfamiliar stirring in his chest. His heart pounded, and for the first time in his life, he felt uncertain. He had never been caught off guard like this. His entire life had been about control, about maintaining a perfect image, and yet, here he stood, faced with a woman who had shattered all of his expectations. He couldn't understand it. The princess was more than he had ever imagined. And yet, it made him question everything he thought he knew. Was he seeing her clearly, or was his mind simply clouded by the stunning beauty before him? His thoughts spun in circles as he struggled to make sense of it all. As the prince stood there, frozen, the room fell silent. The guests, who had been eagerly awaiting this moment, seemed to be just as stunned as he was. The princess's beauty had taken them all by surprise. There were no audible gasps of astonishment, but the collective stillness of the room spoke volumes. It was as if everyone had been holding their breath, waiting for this moment, and now that it had arrived, they didn't know how to react. The prince, despite himself, could not hide the confusion on his face. His usual self-assurance, the mask of calm and composure, slipped as he tried to reconcile what he had been told with what he saw before him. His mouth was dry, and his palms, though hidden beneath his robes, were slick with sweat. His thoughts were scattered, torn between the shock of the princess's beauty and the weight of the duty that rested upon him. He had come into this wedding with one expectation, and now that expectation had been shattered in an instant. The princess, for her part, felt a rush of conflicting emotions. She had spent so many years hiding behind the veil, knowing that the world saw her only through the lens of gossip and assumption. Now, as the veil was removed, she braced herself for the reaction she had always feared. But the prince's reaction, his stunned silence, was not what she had imagined. She had expected judgment, disappointment, perhaps even disdain. But instead, she found herself facing a man who seemed as lost in the moment as she was. Her heart began to race as she tried to gauge his reaction. Did he think her beautiful, or was he merely shocked by the stark contrast between what he had been told and what he was seeing? Her eyes locked with his, and for a brief moment, she saw something there. Something like wonder, like confusion, but also something deeper. Was it admiration? Or was it something else, something more complicated? The prince's struggle was evident in his eyes. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words seemed to elude him. His heart raced, and for the first time in his life, he felt unsure. The woman standing before him was not just a princess, not just a political alliance, but a living, breathing person with beauty and depth that he had never imagined. The prince's mind buzzed with questions, his feelings swirling in a whirlwind of emotions. And in that moment, he realized that the veil had not only concealed the princess's face, but also the truth of what he had been taught to believe about her. It was not just her beauty that had been hidden, but the very essence of who she was, her worth, her intelligence, her kindness, all of it obscured by the lies of the court. The prince's confusion slowly transformed into something more, a deep, unsettling sense of regret for the way he had judged her before even meeting her. The veil had come off, and in doing so, it had revealed more than just her face. It had revealed the truth about everything he had been led to believe. As the veil had been lifted, the prince's world shifted in a way he hadn't anticipated. What had once seemed like a marriage of duty and convenience was now filled with complexity, depth, and, most surprisingly, beauty. As he continued to stand before the princess, still struggling to digest the overwhelming sight of her, a profound sense of realization began to settle within him. His thoughts, once clouded by the rumors and judgments of those around him, now started to clear. And in their place, guilt and regret took root. The prince had always been taught to value outward appearances. As the heir to the throne, he was conditioned to believe in the importance of alliances, of choosing a bride based on political necessity rather than personal connection. The notion of love or emotional connection seemed distant, almost irrelevant. After all, it was his duty to marry the daughter of another kingdom, to unite their realms through his marriage. not to fall in love. His thoughts were steeped in a sense of obligation, reinforced by the whispers of advisors and family members who painted a picture of the princess that was both unkind and unjust. He remembered the conversations, the gossip, the cruel words of those around him. Advisors, courtiers, even distant relatives, all warning him about the princess. They described her as plain, unattractive, and unworthy of his attention. They spoke of her supposed flaws, the so-called imperfections that they said would never be acceptable for a woman of his status. He had been fed these lies for so long that he accepted them without question, dismissing any doubt, convinced that he was making the right choice in adhering to his duties. Now, as he stood there, facing the woman he had been told was undesirable, the prince couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. The image he had been given of the princess, one that had shaped his expectations and fears, was not the truth. She was beautiful, radiantly so, but that beauty was more than just skin deep. It was a beauty that came from within, a beauty that had been concealed by the veil, but that was now impossible to ignore. The prince's thoughts wandered to the moments when he had first learned of his bride-to-be. He had been told, in hushed tones, about her appearance, how plain, how ordinary, how unworthy she was. He recalled how he had accepted these judgments without hesitation, how they had shaped his initial feelings of indifference and even disdain toward the marriage. He had never once considered the possibility that these assessments might be wrong, that the princess was more than what others had led him to believe. He had dismissed her entirely based on rumors, not even giving her the benefit of a first glance. And now, standing before her, he realized how deeply he had been misled. Flashbacks to his first meeting with his advisors played in his mind. He had been young then, filled with ambition but also naivety, listening to their advice without question. He remembered one advisor, a trusted figure, who had looked at him with a knowing smile and warned him, "The princess may not be what you expect, Your Highness. She is not a beauty like the women of your court. She will not turn heads, and she is not one for grand gestures. But this is your duty. Marry her, and the alliance will be strong." The prince, naive and eager to fulfill his role, had nodded in agreement, never once doubting the validity of those words. Now, standing in front of her, his heart sank with regret. He began to realize just how much he had relied on appearances, how he had accepted others' judgments about people, particularly women, without ever questioning their truth. His upbringing had instilled in him the belief that beauty was a superficial quality, something to be admired, but ultimately inconsequential in matters of politics and duty. But now, with the princess standing before him, he was forced to confront a truth he had long overlooked. Beauty was not something that could be quantified or reduced to a simple checklist of features. It was not about symmetry, about flawless skin or perfect proportions. It was something far deeper, something more complex, something that could not be seen with the eyes alone. As he looked at her, the prince found himself drawn to her kindness, to the way her eyes seemed to hold a quiet strength, a wisdom that spoke of resilience and compassion. Her posture was graceful, not just because of the gown she wore, but because of the way she carried herself with a quiet confidence, despite the years of judgment and isolation she had endured. He could see it now, the way she held herself, not as a woman hiding behind a veil, but as someone who had withstood the cruelty of the world and emerged stronger for it. His heart began to race again, but this time, it wasn't out of confusion or surprise. It was because he felt something genuine stir inside him. He began to see her not as the woman who had been hidden away behind a veil, but as a person with depth, with experiences that had shaped her, with a heart that beat with empathy and understanding. He realized that the princess was not just beautiful in the conventional sense. She was beautiful in a way that touched his soul. Her inner strength, her kindness, her warmth. All of these qualities created a beauty that was impossible to ignore. The prince's internal monologue continued, now shifting from regret to realization. He had spent so much of his life pursuing duty and following orders, trusting others to define his choices. But now, standing before the woman who was to be his bride, he understood that true beauty was something far more profound than the fleeting judgments of others. It was something that transcended physical appearance and reached into the very core of a person. And in that moment, he realized that he had been blind to it, that he had missed the most important part of her all along. His mind began to quiet as his heart settled into a new understanding. The beauty of the princess lay not in her appearance, but in her character, the way she had held her head high despite the slings and arrows of those who had tried to tear her down, the way she had retained her kindness and grace despite the world's harshness. The prince could no longer ignore the connection he felt to her, the pull of her heart that seemed to mirror his own. In her, he saw not just a wife, not just an ally, but a partner, someone who understood the complexities of life and had the strength to face them. He felt his guilt transform into a newfound sense of admiration and respect. No longer was the princess the victim of cruel rumors and prejudice. She was a woman who had endured and triumphed, and in her, he saw the true meaning of beauty. His perception of her had shifted, but more importantly, his perception of himself had changed as well. He had been so focused on the surface, on appearances, that he had failed to see the truth beneath it all. But now, with the veil removed, he understood that beauty was not something to be judged. It was something to be felt, something that came from within. And as he stood before her, with his heart swelling with a new understanding, he knew that his life and the course of their marriage would be forever changed. The prince no longer saw the princess as a duty to fulfill, but as a woman to cherish, to respect, and to love. And in that realization, he found not only the beauty of the princess, but the beauty of life itself, the beauty that lay in the heart. As the ceremony continued, a heavy silence fell over the room. The prince and the princess, now standing together, faced one another with an intensity neither had anticipated. The initial shock of seeing the princess without her veil had left the prince momentarily speechless, but what happened next would change his perspective forever. The princess, aware of the prince's discomfort and the swirling emotions within him, took a deep breath and chose to reveal the truth that had been buried within her for so long. She could sense the weight of the prince's confusion, his guilt, and his growing admiration. But there was more to her story than just the veil, more to her than just the outer beauty that had taken him by surprise. This moment, she realized, was her opportunity to finally speak the truth, to reveal the hidden burdens she had carried her entire life. She stepped closer to him, her voice steady, but tinged with emotion. "I know you are surprised, Your Highness," she began, her words soft yet resolute. "But I must tell you that the woman you see before you is not the woman I have always been. My life has been defined by judgments that were never mine to bear." The prince stood still, caught off guard by her openness. He had expected her to be timid, to remain distant, but instead she stood before him as a woman of undeniable strength, a strength he had yet to fully understand. The princess continued, her gaze steady as she recalled the years of pain and isolation. "I have always been told that my appearance was not enough, that I did not meet the standards of beauty that the world demands. From a young age, I was taught to hide, to cover myself, because the world did not know how to accept me as I am." Her voice wavered slightly, but she did not falter. She had spent years hiding behind her veil, not only to protect herself from the harsh judgments of others, but to shield her heart from the pain of rejection. "I was never allowed to feel beautiful, not in the way others expected. People would call me names, mock my features, and treat me as if I were less than human. I was not seen as a person, but as an object to be evaluated, to be judged." The prince listened intently, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. He had never once considered the emotional toll such judgments could take on a person, especially a woman. He had always been taught to view beauty as something superficial, something to be admired and sought after. But now, as he listened to the princess's words, he began to see the cruelty behind these societal standards, the way they could strip away a person's dignity and self-worth. The princess paused, her eyes glistening with the memories of a painful past. "I wore the veil not because I wanted to hide from you or anyone else," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I wore it to protect myself, to shield my heart from the weight of constant judgment. It was easier to remain hidden, to let the world see me as they wished, than to face the cruelty that came with revealing myself fully. I feared rejection, fear that no one would ever truly see me for who I am." As she spoke, the prince's gaze softened, and his chest tightened with empathy. He had never realized how much the princess had suffered, how deeply her sense of self had been wounded by the judgments of others. He had been so focused on his own expectations, his own misunderstandings, that he had failed to see the depth of the woman standing before him. The princess's vulnerability touched him in ways he could not express. She had trusted him with her pain, her deepest insecurities, and he could see the strength it had taken for her to share her story. Her courage stirred something within him, a realization that the princess was not just a beautiful face, but a woman of incredible depth, wisdom, and resilience. "I have spent my entire life trying to conform to the expectations of others," the princess continued, her voice soft but firm. "I have tried to be what the world wanted me to be, only to find that I could never measure up. But in the end, I learned that it wasn't about meeting those standards. It was about accepting myself, about embracing who I truly am, despite what others might think or say." Her words echoed in the prince's heart, striking a chord deep within him. He had spent so much of his life adhering to the expectations of others, living by rules and traditions that had been handed down to him. He had never considered the possibility of breaking free from those chains, of seeing the world and people in a new light. The princess's words opened his eyes to a new way of thinking, a way that valued the essence of a person rather than their outward appearance. He reached out, his hand gently taking hers, offering her comfort in the only way he knew how. The connection between them, once tenuous and fraught with misunderstanding, now felt strong and unbreakable. In that moment, the prince realized that the princess's true beauty was not just in her appearance, but in the wisdom and strength she carried within. She had endured so much, and yet she had not allowed the world's cruelty to break her spirit. That, he understood, was true beauty. The princess, for the first time in her life, felt seen. She had spent years hiding behind her veil, afraid to show the world who she truly was. But now, standing before the prince, she felt a sense of release, as though the weight of her fears and insecurities had been lifted. She had shared her truth, and in doing so, she had freed herself from the shame and guilt that had plagued her for so long. The prince, moved by her courage and vulnerability, could not help but feel a deep admiration for her. He had expected to marry a woman based on political alliance, but he had never expected to find a partner so full of strength, intelligence, and grace. His perception of her had shifted completely, and in that moment, he knew that this marriage was not just about duty, it was about something far more meaningful. "You are more than I could have ever imagined," the prince said softly, his voice filled with sincerity. "You are not just beautiful, you are extraordinary. Your strength, your courage, your wisdom, these are the things that truly matter, and I am grateful that you have trusted me with your story." The princess, her heart swelling with emotion, nodded. For the first time in her life, she felt a sense of belonging, a sense that she was not just a symbol of duty or an object of judgment, but a woman who was worthy of love and respect. In that moment, the prince and the princess stood together, not as strangers bound by duty, but as two individuals who had learned to see beyond the surface and embrace each other for who they truly were. And as they faced the future, they knew that their bond would be stronger than any judgment, any expectation, or any societal standard. They had found in each other a love that transcended appearances, a love built on mutual respect, understanding, and acceptance. The prince stood alone in the garden, his mind racing with turmoil. He had never felt so conflicted, so burdened by guilt. His previous thoughts about the princess, the judgments he had passed on her without knowing the truth, now seemed like a betrayal not only of the woman who stood before him, but of everything he had come to believe about himself. The realization hit him hard. He had been so wrapped up in the rumors, in the opinions of others, that he had failed to see the princess for who she truly was. He had judged her based on her appearance, even before meeting her, and now he was left with a deep sense of regret. The weight of his actions was unbearable, and he knew he had to make things right. The sounds of the palace echoed around him as he walked with purpose toward the princess's chambers. His heart thudded in his chest, each step feeling heavier than the last. He had been a prince all his life, used to authority and command, but in this moment he felt as vulnerable as a child. He could no longer ignore the truth of his actions. The only thing that mattered now was making amends. When he reached the door to her chambers, he hesitated for a moment. The last time they had spoken, it had been filled with confusion, with the princess's hurt and his own shock. He was unsure of how she would respond to him now, unsure of whether she would even want to hear what he had to say. But he knew that if he truly wanted to make things right, he had to apologize. He had to be honest, and he had to show her that he was no longer the man who had judged her so harshly. Taking a deep breath, he knocked on the door. A few moments later, the door creaked open, and the princess stood before him, her face calm, but with an air of sadness still lingering in her eyes. She had been through so much, and the prince knew that his actions had added to her pain. The thought of her suffering because of his ignorance made his heart ache. "Your Highness," she greeted him quietly, her voice steady but cool. She did not look at him with anger or bitterness, but there was a distance in her gaze, as if she was waiting for him to prove himself worthy of her trust. The prince swallowed hard, feeling his throat tighten. He had never been good at expressing vulnerability, never been taught to apologize for his actions. But this was different. He had wronged her in a way that went beyond words, and he knew that if he ever hoped to regain her respect, he had to start with the truth. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I was wrong, so wrong. I judged you before I even knew you. I believed the rumors, the stories that were told about you, and I allowed them to shape my perception of who you were. I never gave you the chance to show me who you truly are." The princess remained silent, her expression unreadable, but the prince could see the hurt in her eyes. He knew she was waiting for him to continue, to speak the words that would come from the depths of his heart. "I was a fool," he continued, his voice trembling slightly. "I thought I could marry you without understanding what it meant to truly know someone. I looked at your outward appearance and let it cloud my judgment. I should have seen the strength in you, the kindness, the depth that you possess. Instead, I only saw what others told me to see." His words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of his guilt. The prince looked down at the floor, unable to meet her gaze. He felt like a child who had made a mistake too big to fix, but he knew that he had to try. "I want to make this right," he said, his voice now firm with sincerity. "I can't undo the harm I've done, but I want to be better. I want to see you for who you really are, not through the lens of others' judgments. I want to understand you, learn about you, and see the person you truly are. And above all, I want to apologize for the hurt I caused." There was a long pause as the princess considered his words. The prince's heart beat faster, uncertain of what her response would be. He had exposed his flaws, his ignorance, and now it was up to her to decide whether or not she could forgive him. Finally, the princess spoke. Her voice was soft, but there was a warmth in it that the prince had not expected. "You hurt me, Your Highness," she said quietly. and I am not sure if you can ever fully understand the pain that comes with being judged by someone who is supposed to be your partner. But I see the sincerity in your eyes, and I hear the regret in your voice." Her words struck him deeply, and he realized that this moment, this apology, was the beginning of a new chapter for them both. It was not just an apology, it was a chance for them to start over, to rebuild their relationship from a place of honesty and understanding. The princess took a step closer to him, her eyes softening. "I forgive you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But you must understand that trust is something that must be earned. I will need time to heal, to learn to trust you again. But I am willing to give you that chance, if you are willing to prove yourself." The prince nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. He knew that this was just the beginning of a long journey, one that would require patience, understanding, and effort from both of them. But in that moment, he felt the weight of his guilt lift, and a new sense of hope blossomed within him. He had hurt her, but he had also taken the first step toward redemption. "I will prove myself," he said, his voice steady. "I will show you, every day, that I am worthy of your trust." The princess smiled, a small but genuine smile that made the prince's heart swell with emotion. It was a small gesture, but it was enough. In that moment, they both knew that they had the potential to build something real, something meaningful, a relationship based on mutual respect, understanding, and love. As the prince left her chambers, he felt a sense of calm settle over him. The apology had not fixed everything, but it had opened the door to healing. He knew that the road ahead would not be easy, but for the first time in a long while, he felt confident that he was on the right path. And as he walked through the palace corridors, he could not help but think that perhaps the true beauty of life lay not in perfection, but in the willingness to change, to learn, and to grow together. As days turned into weeks, the prince found himself spending more and more time with the princess. Their initial awkwardness had faded, replaced by moments of quiet understanding. It was clear that both of them were learning to see each other in a different light, and the prince could not help but marvel at the transformation in their relationship. At first, he had believed that their connection would be based solely on appearances, a fleeting attraction that would soon fade once the novelty of their marriage wore off. But he had been wrong. What he discovered was far deeper than anything he had anticipated. As the prince observed her more closely, he began to see beyond the veil of physical beauty. The princess was far more than just a face. She was a woman of intellect, wisdom, and compassion, qualities that he had never considered before. He found himself drawn to the way she carried herself, the way she spoke with such conviction when discussing matters of the kingdom and the people they served. There was a quiet power in her words, a strength that came from experience and a deep understanding of the world around her. One evening, as they sat together in the palace garden, the prince found himself lost in conversation with her. It was a rare moment of peace in a life that was often consumed by royal duties, and he relished the opportunity to hear her speak, without the pressure of being constantly watched by courtiers and advisors. The princess spoke of her childhood, her education, and the struggles she had faced in a world that valued beauty above all else. Her voice was calm but filled with passion, and the prince could see the fire that burned within her, a fire that had been carefully hidden behind her veil for so long. "I was always told that I wasn't enough," the princess confided, her eyes distant as she looked at the stars above them. "That I wasn't beautiful enough, or graceful enough, or worthy of love. I spent my life trying to fit into a mold that was never meant for me." The prince listened intently, his heart aching as he realized the depth of the pain she had endured. He had known that she had faced judgment, but hearing her speak about it so openly made him realize how much she had sacrificed to survive in a world that had only valued her for her looks. He couldn't fathom how it must have felt to live under such constant scrutiny, to be reduced to nothing more than a figure of judgment. "But you are beautiful," he said quietly, his voice sincere. The princess turned to him, her eyes softening as she met his gaze. For the first time, she saw the genuine admiration in his eyes, not just for her physical appearance, but for the person she was. She had never known such respect before, and it touched her more deeply than she could express. "I've learned to appreciate beauty in different ways," the prince continued, his voice steady. "At first, I only saw what others wanted me to see. But now I see you. I see the woman who carries so much wisdom, so much strength. I see your kindness, your ability to care for others, your determination to do what is right. That, to me, is true beauty." The princess smiled, a small but heartfelt smile. She could see that the prince had changed, that his perception of her had shifted. And for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that he truly saw her, not just the woman in the veil, but the woman beneath it. As their relationship deepened, the prince found himself admiring the princess in ways he never imagined. She was not only intelligent and capable, but she also had an innate grace that guided her through difficult decisions. Her ability to remain calm in the face of adversity, her compassion for the people of the kingdom, and her unwavering strength in times of crisis left the prince in awe. He began to understand that the princess was not simply the woman he had been told about. She was someone extraordinary, someone who had the power to shape the future of their realm. The more he learned about her, the more he realized that she was the leader he had always needed, someone who could guide him with wisdom and vision. She was not just his wife, but his equal, a partner in every sense of the word. He was amazed by her ability to see the bigger picture, to make decisions that were not just for her own benefit, but for the good of the people they served. Her intelligence and compassion were qualities he had never expected to find in someone who had been judged so harshly by society. The princess, too, began to open up to the prince in ways she had never allowed herself to before. She had spent so many years hiding behind her veil, protecting herself from the world's judgment, that she had forgotten what it felt like to be truly seen. But with the prince, she felt safe. She felt like she could finally be herself, without fear of rejection or ridicule. And as their bond grew stronger, she began to trust him more, to share the depth of her thoughts, her dreams, and her fears. One afternoon, as they sat together in the palace library, the princess shared her hopes for the future. "I want to create a kingdom where beauty is not defined by appearance," she said, her voice filled with conviction. "Where every person, no matter their background, can be valued for who they are on the inside. Where kindness, intelligence, and compassion are the true measures of worth." The prince listened carefully, his admiration for her growing with each word. "I think that's a vision we can achieve together," he said, his voice filled with determination. "I'll support you in any way I can. We can build that future." And in that moment, the prince realized that his feelings for the princess had evolved into something deeper than he could have ever imagined. He was no longer just admiring her from afar. He was falling in love with her. He loved her not only for her beauty, but for the person she was. Someone who had taught him to see the world in a new way. Someone who had shown him the true meaning of strength and grace. The princess, too, felt the shift in her heart. She had never imagined that her marriage to the prince could turn into something so meaningful. But as they continued to spend time together, as they shared their hopes and dreams, she began to see him not as the man who had once judged her, but as the man who had come to admire her for everything she was. Their growing love was built on a foundation of respect, admiration, and shared values. They no longer saw each other through the lens of societal expectations or superficial judgments. Instead, they saw each other as equals, partners in the truest sense of the word. And as their love blossomed, they both knew that they were capable of achieving greatness together, both as rulers and as individuals. The prince had learned that beauty was not just something you could see with your eyes, but something you could feel with your heart. And the princess had learned that true love was not about being perfect. It was about being seen, truly seen for who you were. Together, they had found something far more valuable than fleeting attraction or superficial admiration. They had found a love that was deep, genuine, and lasting. As the days passed following the wedding, the kingdom was abuzz with whispers about the princess. News of her unveiled beauty spread quickly, and the once scorned woman who had been hidden away behind a veil was now the subject of everyone's admiration. It didn't take long for the citizens and courtiers who had previously mocked her to come face to face with the truth they had long ignored. The courtiers, who had once criticized the princess for her appearance, found themselves speechless when they saw her for the first time without the veil. They had all believed the rumors, the cruel gossip about her supposed unattractiveness, the assumptions that had led them to treat her with disdain. But now, standing before them, was a woman of striking beauty, elegance, and grace, far beyond what they had imagined. Their initial shock was quickly followed by embarrassment as they realized how wrong they had been. Some courtiers, realizing the weight of their past actions, rushed to offer their apologies. They tried to make amends by praising the princess's beauty and expressing their regret for having ever doubted her. Their words, however, felt hollow to those who had been around long enough to understand that their flattery was driven by guilt rather than genuine admiration. Lady Maren, a courtier who had been one of the loudest critics of the princess's appearance, approached her with a forced smile. "Your Highness," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I must admit I was mistaken in my judgments. You are far more beautiful than I ever realized." Her attempt at sincerity was palpable, but there was an undertone of discomfort, as if she were still struggling to accept the truth of what she had once believed. The princess, while grateful for the apology, could see through the insincerity. She nodded politely, but did not offer her forgiveness outright. She had learned that words were easy to say, but actions were what truly mattered. It wasn't enough for Lady Maren to praise her beauty now. It was her attitude and actions in the past that had shaped the princess's view of her. But not all courtiers were willing to face their mistakes. Many, especially those who had always held high status in the court, were too proud to admit they had been wrong. They continued to look down on the princess with subtle disdain, their faces hidden behind carefully maintained masks of indifference. Their private thoughts were filled with resentment as they saw her beauty as a threat to their own standing. They could not bring themselves to apologize or recognize her worth, and their refusal to do so created a palpable tension in the palace. Behind closed doors, the courtiers would gossip about the princess, muttering in hushed tones about the sudden transformation they had witnessed. They would recount the princess's supposed ugliness of the past, dismissing it as an illusion, as if their previous judgments had never been valid to begin with. Their unwillingness to accept the truth created a rift between the old and new court members, with some still unable to look past their prejudice. The kingdom's citizens were no better. While many marveled at the princess's newfound beauty, there were still whispers in the streets. Some spoke of how they had never believed the rumors, while others tried to excuse their previous judgment by claiming they had only followed what the court had told them. However, the truth of the princess's appearance left them with a heavy sense of guilt. How many had treated her unfairly because of her supposed looks? How many had been part of the mob that had mocked her? Despite the public's shock and the court's divided reactions, the prince and princess remained steadfast. They had long been aware of the judgments placed upon them, and now, as a united front, they resolved to use their royal platform to challenge the very norms that had caused so much pain. The princess, who had once hidden behind her veil, now stood tall, no longer allowing her appearance to define her worth. With the prince by her side, she began speaking out about the dangers of judging people based on their looks. Together, they made it their mission to promote inclusivity and compassion in the kingdom. One day, at a royal gathering, the princess addressed the court and the citizens with a speech that would forever change the direction of their kingdom. "I stand before you today," she began, her voice steady and strong, "not as a woman defined by her appearance, but as a person with a heart, a mind, and a soul. We live in a world that values beauty above all else, but I have come to learn that true beauty is found within. It is found in the kindness we show to others, in the compassion we offer to those who are struggling, and in the strength we find to rise above the judgments of others. The prince stood beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. Together, we can build a kingdom where every individual is valued for who they are, not just how they look, he added. We can create a place where people are encouraged to see beyond the surface and appreciate the depth and worth of one another. The speech was met with mixed reactions, but it was clear that the message had been received by many. Some of the courtiers who had once been hesitant began to look at the princess with newfound respect. Others, however, remained entrenched in their old ways, unwilling to change. But the prince and princess did not falter. They continued to challenge the status quo, using their position to raise awareness about the harmful effects of societal beauty standards. Slowly, the kingdom began to change. Citizens started to embrace diversity, not just in appearance, but in thought and character as well. The idea that beauty could be found in many different forms took root, and people began to value qualities like kindness, intelligence, and resilience over superficial traits. In the palace, the atmosphere shifted. The prince and princess's relationship became a symbol of unity, respect, and love. As they worked together to promote these new ideals, they became a beacon of hope for those who had long felt marginalized by the shallow judgments of others. The kingdom was not without its challenges. There would always be those who clung to outdated beliefs, those who were too proud to admit their mistakes. But the prince and princess knew that their love and their mission to create a more inclusive and compassionate society would continue to inspire change. And as they moved forward, they did so with the knowledge that they were no longer defined by others' perceptions, but by the love they shared and the legacy they would leave behind. As time passed, the prince and princess grew into their roles as rulers of the kingdom. Their love, forged through adversity and understanding, became a shining example of what true beauty and love looked like. They ruled not only with authority, but with wisdom and compassion, focusing on values that were far more important than appearances. Their commitment to these ideals transformed their kingdom, setting it on a path toward a future built on empathy, kindness, and mutual respect. The court, once a place of division and judgment, had become a model of inclusivity. People from all walks of life were welcomed, valued not for how they looked, but for who they were as individuals. The prince and princess had worked tirelessly to create a society where inner beauty, the beauty of the heart and mind, was seen as the most valuable trait. Their efforts to change the mindset of their people were not without challenges, but they persevered, knowing that true transformation would take time. As the years went by, the couple became known not just for their beauty, though they were both undeniably attractive, but for the way they treated everyone they met. Their kindness was legendary, their generosity apparent in every decision they made. They supported causes that uplifted the poor and marginalized, using their wealth and power to provide opportunities for those who had been overlooked by society. In every aspect of their lives, they embodied the very principles they had fought for since their wedding day. The people of the kingdom began to reflect these values in their own lives. The court, once obsessed with surface-level beauty, now celebrated character, integrity, and kindness. Citizens worked